Bonjour et bienvenue à AfriqueCanada TV. Je m'appelle Leila Lemgalef et je vous parle à partir du siège de l'Organisation de l'Aviation civile internationale à Montréal. Il s'agit de la 38e assemblée générale de l'OACI. Nous allons nous entretenir avec nos distingués invités pour discuter des normes de la sécurité aérienne, principalement au niveau des pays africains. Dans un premier temps, Nancy Graham, la directrice de la Direction de la Navigation Aérienne. Et dans un deuxième temps, Aboubekerine Seddigh Oud Mohamed El Hassan, directeur général de l'Agence nationale de l'aviation civile en Mauritanie, pour parler du cas de son pays. Thank you very much for having us at ICAO headquarters. Mrs. Nancy Graham, would you please start off by giving us a brief overview of your professional background?
I'm an unusual animal. My background is early in my days as a torpedo mechanic. However, in the last 20 years, I've been focused on aviation and specifically aviation safety. A lot of what is done in different fields as it relates to safety has a lot of commonality. So for many years I worked for the Federal Aviation Administration in different parts of the world and came to ICAO about 6 years ago. And my responsibilities here include everything related to safety, all of the 13 disciplines of air navigation and the audit program.
We are heading into the last few months of 2013, and I read about ICAO's holistic approach to aviation safety. Would you give us a brief overview of safety standards and activities today?
Yeah, indeed. So one of ICAO's roles is to develop the international standards for safety, for air navigation, for security, for environment. And in the safety area, we've had a very long history of doing so, since 1944, as a matter of fact. And we've seen quite an evolution over the years, and particularly in the last few years. There's been a real focus, and that has been fueled largely by technology in safety. You see very, very safe aircraft. You see wonderfully trained professionals and a real culture of aviation safety. Mm-hmm. So as a result of all of that, plus the partnership with a variety of international organizations, you see the safest skies in the world in the last 2 years.
Would you like to expand on that and tell us a bit more what that involved?
Indeed. So the number one issue that we face today in terms of safety for passengers is runway excursions, meaning when an aircraft goes beyond the runway, and runway incursions, when something that shouldn't be on the runway is on the runway. And we have a program called Runway Safety, which addresses those things. And we have a practical set of tools for each airport working with its international community, because it's air navigation service providers or air traffic controllers, mm-hmm. pilots that use that fly the aircraft, and the airports themselves have to work together to understand that very highly choreographed environment to keep those runways and the surrounding aprons safe. And so we've put a lot of focus there, and we've had an international symposium here and then a series of regional events. Our second area of priority is something called loss of control, which is a big category. But it has in its category what happened, for example, with Air France, where a pilot loses what we call situational awareness, mm-hmm. The situation surprises the pilot, and then they lose control. We also saw that in the most recent situation in San Francisco mm-hmm. as well.
So we're going to turn to African countries.
Okay.
In relation to safety standards, how are African countries doing?
Actually, we are seeing a lot of improvement in Africa, and I'm very happy to say that. It's a challenging area to work because there are many demands on the resources in Africa. We all know that, and in many of the developing countries. But ICAO for the last 6 years has had a program called the AFI program, mm-hmm. which has specifically focused on African countries and providing assistance in areas where we know there are particular challenges, either a lack of understanding of the international rules and regulations, or a lack lack of human resources or a lack of training. But particularly in the last few years, we've focused on the political will. Before you can really make a change, you have to have the political will to do so. And that's so important for states because aviation is a huge economic engine. It brings jobs, it brings transport for goods, it brings the economic fuel that you need to really develop.
So we're just going to trickle into that question. If you would please tell us what African country has emerged as a country that has improved in its best practices and its standards of safety in aviation?
I would be pleased to do that. In fact, Mauritania is one of them. In fact, the challenge that they faced is they were one of the countries that had one of the lowest levels of implementation of the standards and regulations that are practiced by the international aviation community. On a scale of 0 to 100, they were at 32% implementation, which is, at least when I went to school, an F. Really bad. Okay. And in a span of just more than a year, recently we reevaluated Mauritania, and they have improved their implementation of these standards to 75%. Now the global average is 60%. So that's quite high, actually, and on par with many of the states around the world. So huge progress in a relatively short period of time. I have to say that's down to both political will and a very, very active Director General for Aviation. We call him our latest superstar in Africa.
I know that in part Mauritania did use ICAO's resources to make those improvements.
Partially.
If you could just tell us how you would describe ICAO's impact and influence on African development of safety.
Sure. So ICAO is a tiny organization. We're one of 4 specialized organizations of the United Nations. Throughout the world, we have less than 600 people, so it's very tiny. We have 2 African regional offices, and they have 6 or 8 people that are specialized in all of the disciplines of aviation. What ICAO's resources are in this arena is we help the states provide a plan of action. So we sit down with them and actually work through, this is what you need to do in order to improve these scores. These are the critical areas that are most related to risk and that are most likely to cause an aviation accident. So we spend time with them and help them develop an overall plan. We also work with the minister and even in some cases the president of the country to make certain that that Director General has the backing necessary to get the resources to actually make those kinds of improvements. And in the case of Mauritania, though, they went and really worked with their neighbors, which I have to say is fantastic. We totally support regional working organizations, regional solutions. Each state is different and each region is different. But this particular DG was very clever. He used a system that we have in ICAO called iStars, which is a transparent system about the scores of audits. And he looked at his neighbors to see who had higher scores than he did. And he went to those neighbors and he entered into agreements with them for assistance. So rather than the limited resources of ICAO, I would say it was quite ingenious on his part to really look at the resources of his neighbors and the experience there that really did help him.
Can you please tell us about the recently nominated Regional Aviation Safety Group Chairman?
I can. In fact, each of the regions has something called a Regional Aviation Safety Group. It's a new initiative, and it's been formulated so that the region helps itself. It takes on board safety initiatives and then spreads that message across its particular region. Your Director General was recently nominated as the chairman of the African Regional Aviation Safety Group. In this case, it's Pan-African, so it's across Africa. And the focus of that group is to do exactly what he just did, which is to move those states from a very low effective of implementation, the ones that need the assistance, to a much higher effective implementation rate so that it really supports African safety across the continent. He was chosen because of his both experience but also because of his enthusiasm and energy for aviation safety. And so he should be, and Mauritania should be very proud of that nomination. I fully expect, knowing him well, that he will be helping a lot of states make that significant movement and that big jump in aviation safety.
I learned on your website that air traffic is expected to double in the next 15 years. Can you tell us a bit about initiatives going forward, including, I think, GASP initiative?
Yep. During this assembly, which is why we're here for these 2 weeks, we have two plans that are really going to lead the future of aviation. One is called the Global Aviation Safety Plan, and it lays out those two priorities I mentioned before, things having to do with the runway and also this loss of control issue. And in the area of air navigation, we have something called the Global Air Navigation Plan, and it's outlined 3 priorities. One is performance-based navigation, which basically means there's a bubble around the aircraft that we know the aircraft won't deviate beyond based on its capabilities, and we allow it to enter into and protect airspace specifically for that bubble. That's called performance-based navigation. And then we have something called continuous descent operation, continuous climb operation. Basically, an aircraft, when it takes off and then it levels off. It takes off and it rises and levels off. We actually want them to be able to cruise climb to a certain altitude and to descend at a certain rate. That saves fuel, which is better for our environment. So a lot of the work that we're doing is supportive of reduced emissions, which is good for the environment and is good for the economics. So what we've developed is a series of modules, small incremental improvements that will be taken on by all states, but at the rate in which they need them. So it's a bit like a Rubik's Cube. You know, you pick the ones that you need based on your density of traffic. At the end of the day, however, it makes sure that your flying experience in Africa is the same as your flying experience in Asia or North America or anywhere else.
Thank you very much. And finally, before signing off, what message, if any additional message, would you have for our viewers on this African rubric?
Well, I would say I am very bullish on Africa. I think there's tremendous potential there. You do have bright spots where you're seeing some real leadership in Africa. This is one example in Mauritania. Sudan is another where we've seen some significant improvements. We have only hope for the future, and I think in particular aviation brings a globe smaller and smaller, and it is the economic engine for growth. So we really want to see a lot of focus put on aviation so that it brings a brighter future for all Africans.
Thank you so very much for your time, and on behalf of AfriqueCanada TV and its audiences, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.